The explosion leveled the block before anyone could react. Sirens cut off mid-wail as Homelander punched through the smoke, cameras already rolling, a rehearsed speech forming on his lips. He never delivered it. A bald man in a yellow suit stood where the blast had been, unharmed, eyes calm, posture relaxed, like the violence hadn't earned his attention yet. Homelander hovered closer, smiling too wide, lasers primed. The man didn't flinch. He looked around instead at the bodies, the collapsed buildings, the civilians still screaming, and his expression changed. Not anger, not shock, decision. When Homelander lunged, the air cracked once. Not a punch, just a step. The shockwave erased the street, flattened every camera drone, and sent Homelander tumbling miles away, alive but broken in ways no one could name. The man exhaled slowly and looked up at the darkening sky, as if measuring how rotten the system above him really was. And for the first time, the world understood this wasn't a rescue. It was an inspection, and it had only just begun. This isn't a one-time event. What just happened sets off a chain of judgments that won't stop here. Entire systems will be tested, heroes will be exposed, and some won't survive the verdict. Subscribe once, because missing the next step means missing the point of this story. The city was already burning when Saitama arrived. It wasn't an invasion. It wasn't a war. It was a controlled incident, according to Vought's internal memos. A rogue soup had gone off script, a few city blocks were designated expendable, and Homelander had been dispatched to end it publicly. The cameras were positioned before the smoke cleared. The narrative was ready before the bodies stopped moving. Saitama landed in the middle of it without spectacle. No impact crater, no shockwave, just a quiet arrival in the ruins of a convenience store that no longer existed. He took in the scene the way a professional did, eyes moving slowly from shattered storefronts to overturned cars to the civilians bleeding out in the street. His cape fluttered once, then settled. Homelander noticed him last. He finished tearing the rogue soup in half, held the corpse up for the cameras, and smiled. That smile faltered when he realized someone was standing behind him, not cowering, not filming, just standing there, hands at his sides, watching with an expression that wasn't fear or awe. It was evaluation. Homelander turned fully, floating a few feet above the ground, posture relaxed but deliberate. "You lost, buddy," he called out, voice warm, rehearsed. "This is a restricted area." Saitama didn't answer immediately. He looked past Homelander instead, toward a woman pinned under a slab of concrete, her breathing shallow, blood pooling beneath her. Then he moved, not fast, not dramatic. He lifted the concrete with one hand, set it aside carefully, and nodded once at the woman before turning back. Homelander felt it then. Not power, not pressure. Irrelevance. "You're supposed to leave," Homelander said, smile tightening. His eyes glowed faintly, just enough for the cameras to catch. "Now." Saitama met his gaze. "You're causing unnecessary damage," he said. His voice was flat, almost bored, but there was no humor in it. "Stop." The word landed heavier than any threat Homelander had ever heard. He laughed reflexively, a sharp bark meant to reassert control. "You don't get to tell me." He lunged. Not full speed, not lethal force, just enough to make a point, to remind everyone watching who decided when violence ended. His fist cut through the air toward Saitama's face. Saitama stepped forward once. The movement was small, almost lazy, but the air screamed as it compressed. The shockwave rolled outward, pulverizing what was left of the street, snapping camera drones out of the sky like insects, and slamming Homelander backward hard enough to punch him through 3 buildings before he skidded to a stop miles away. Saitama didn't pursue. He stood still as debris settled, cape snapping once before going still again. He looked down at his own hand, flexed it slightly, then relaxed. That had been the minimum. He was sure of it. Across the city, Homelander crawled out of the rubble, disoriented. His ears rang, his vision blurred. Nothing hurt the way it should have, but something was wrong. His balance was off. His breath came too fast. He hadn't even seen the punch. The cameras hadn't either. Vought executives watched the feeds go dark in real time, panic spreading through the control room. "Get eyes back on him," someone shouted. "Spin this. Spin it now." They couldn't. Every independent camera caught the same thing. Homelander attacking first, then vanishing from frame like he'd been swatted by the world itself. No explosion, no visible impact, just absence followed by devastation. Billy Butcher saw it from a stolen tablet in a safe house across town. He replayed the clip 3 times, jaw clenched tighter each time. "That ain't a soup," he muttered. "That's a problem." Huey stared pale. He didn't even look angry. "Yeah," Butcher replied. "That's the scary part." Back at Ground Zero, Saitama walked through the wreckage, pulling survivors free, pointing wordlessly for medics when they finally dared to approach. No speeches, no acknowledgement of the cameras that had started creeping back in from a distance. Sirens wailed again, tentative this time. Military helicopters hovered at the edge of the airspace, holding position. No one had given the order to engage. No one wanted to be the one responsible if it went wrong. Saitama looked up briefly, eyes tracking the aircraft. They weren't a threat. He dismissed them as such and turned away. Homelander returned minutes later, fury barely contained. He hovered high above the street, chest heaving, eyes blazing brighter than before. "You don't touch me," he screamed, the sound cracking windows for blocks. "I am." Saitama looked up. Just once. Homelander froze mid-rant. Not physically, mentally. The look he met wasn't fearsome. It wasn't impressed. It was the look of someone deciding whether something needed to continue existing in its current form. "You're done," Saitama said quietly. "Go home." The command wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. Homelander felt something inside him collapse. Not bone, not muscle, but certainty. He wanted to argue, to threaten, to burn the city down just to prove he could. Instead, he hesitated. That hesitation was caught on camera. Across the world, viewers watched their strongest hero falter in midair, screaming halted, confidence leaking away in real time. Vought's stock ticker began to drop before anyone understood why. Homelander vanished in a sonic boom, retreating without explanation, without victory, without narrative control. Saitama watched him go, expression unreadable. He turned back to the ruined street, to the people still pulling themselves from debris, to the system that had allowed this to happen over and over again. He took a slow breath, then another. "This world's broken," he said softly, to no one in particular. He looked up at the skyline, at the towers that housed power far more fragile than they pretended to be. And someone needs to fix it. Far above, unseen, plans were already being rewritten. Vought initiated containment protocols. The boys began digging for answers they weren't sure they wanted. Homelander flew until the city was a blur beneath him, trying to outrun a feeling he'd never known before. Saitama started walking. And with every step, the world moved closer to a decision it could not avoid. Fear used to arrive before Homelander did. Sirens, evacuations, panicked voices on the news. By the time he showed up, the city was already conditioned to react. Fear softened resistance. It made lies easier to sell and authority easier to fake. Vought had built an empire on that rhythm, a clean cycle of threat, spectacle, and relief. That cycle broke overnight. The footage of Homelander hesitating spread faster than any spin team could contain it. Not the impact, not the destruction, but the pause. The moment where the most feared man on Earth stopped midair and reconsidered. Analysts tried to blur it. Commentators talked over it. Vought pushed alternative angles and expert opinions. None of it mattered. People replayed the silence. Homelander locked himself inside a private Vought facility, tearing through reinforced walls in bursts of frustration before stopping short of anything that might actually damage the structure. He stared at his reflection in the glass, jaw clenched, breath uneven. He hadn't felt pain. He hadn't been beaten. But he had been dismissed. That thought looped endlessly, corroding everything it touched. Across the city, Saitama continued moving. He didn't hunt Homelander. He didn't chase leads or interrogate suspects. He followed damage. Wherever lies had turned into blood, he showed up, not with explosions but with presence. Quiet, undeniable. In a low-income district abandoned during a controlled demolition, Saitama stopped a soup mid-rampage without throwing a punch. The man charged him, screaming, veins lit with compound V, and froze when his fist met Saitama's palm and went nowhere. The soup collapsed seconds later, unconscious, overwhelmed not by force, but by the realization that nothing he did mattered. The crowd watching didn't cheer. They stared. Fear didn't tell them what to do anymore. Billy Butcher tracked the pattern from a distance, cigarette burning forgotten between his fingers. "He's not playing the game," he said to the team. "Not ours, not theirs." Huey nodded slowly. "He's not reacting, he's correcting." That word stuck with them. Vought tried Escalation next, not with Homelander, but with assets. Experimental subs were deployed under the guise of disaster response. Specialized units with heavier firepower and tighter media control moved in. Hopping volume would replace intimidation. Saitama met them all the same way. He stood still. Bullets flattened against his skin. Explosives dispersed around him without leaving a mark. When he moved, it was to disarm, to knock out, to end fights before they began. The footage was useless, too clean, too anticlimactic. No struggle. No chaos to frame as heroism. "Why isn't he killing anyone?" a Vought executive demanded during an emergency meeting. "Because he doesn't have to," another replied, voice shaking. "And that's worse." Homelander couldn't take it anymore. He burst out of containment at dawn, flying straight toward the last reported sighting of Saitama. Not a rescue zone, not a disaster, a courthouse. The place where truth was supposed to mean something. Saitama stood on the steps, listening to a group of displaced families argue with officials who had already decided their case. When Homelander landed, the shockwave sent papers scattering and guards scrambling. "You think you can just replace me?" Homelander roared, eyes blazing, voice cracking with something dangerously close to desperation. "This world needs fear." Saitama turned slowly. "No," he said, "it doesn't." Homelander attacked without warning this time, lasers slicing through the air, fists swinging with lethal intent. Saitama didn't counterattack. He stepped through it, letting the beams wash harmlessly over him, catching Homelander's wrist mid-strike. The grip wasn't crushing. It was firm. Homelander struggled, muscles straining, eyes wide. He couldn't pull free. He couldn't push forward. For the first time in his life, his strength had nowhere to go. Saitama leaned in just enough for Homelander to hear him over the sirens and screaming. "You're loud," he said, "but you don't protect anyone." He let go. Homelander stumbled backward, not thrown, not hurt, just unbalanced. Cameras caught everything. The crowd watched as their supposed god staggered like a man who'd forgotten how gravity worked. "You don't scare me," Saitama continued, voice steady. "And if you don't scare me, you don't scare anyone." That was the punch. Not physical, not visible. Homelander screamed and fled again, the sound raw and unfiltered, stripped of performance. No heroic framing followed him this time, just silence. Vought stock crashed before noon. Governments began to distance themselves publicly, denouncing practices they had quietly funded for years. Contracts dissolved. Hearings were scheduled. Lies that relied on fear to survive started collapsing under their own weight. The boys watched it unfold, with a mix of satisfaction and unease. "This is too fast," MM said. "Systems don't fall this clean." Butcher nodded. "That's 'cause he's not tearing them down, he's making them irrelevant." Saitama left the courthouse as quietly as he'd arrived. He didn't stay for interviews. He didn't claim responsibility. He moved on to the next place where damage outweighed truth. By nightfall, the city felt different. Not safer, quieter. Like everyone was holding their breath, waiting to see what happened when fear no longer dictated behavior. High above, Homelander hovered in the clouds, shaking. His power still worked. His body was still invincible. But none of it meant anything if no one believed in it. Saitama paused on a rooftop, looking out over the darkened skyline. He wasn't tired. He wasn't angry. He was assessing. "This won't stop on its own," he said softly. Behind closed doors, plans were already forming. Vought wasn't finished. Governments weren't finished. They would adapt, rebrand, escalate in subtler ways. And somewhere deep in the system, something far worse than Homelander began to realize that fear was no longer a reliable tool. That realization would not be ignored. The system didn't panic. It adapted. Vought International had survived scandals before. Congressional hearings, leaked footage, civilian casualties. None of it had ever mattered as long as the narrative held. Heroes frightened people into compliance, and compliance kept the machine running. Saitama had broken fear, but fear was only one lever. The system had others. Within 48 hours, the language changed. Press releases stopped mentioning Homelander's temporary absence and started emphasizing distributed security. Panels of experts appeared on every network, calmly explaining that no single soup should ever hold that much power. Responsibility was reframed as progress. Restraint became a selling point. Vought didn't deny Saitama's existence. They contextualized him. "He's a foreign anomaly," one analyst said smoothly. "Unregulated, unaccountable, a destabilizing force." That word spread fast. Destabilizing. Saitama watched one of the broadcasts from a diner television while eating quietly. The volume was low, but he didn't need to hear every word. The tone was enough. He finished his meal, paid in cash, and stood. "They're trying to make this about me," he said, more observant than annoyed. Outside, armored vehicles rolled into the city under joint federal authority. Not to fight him, to frame him. Checkpoints went up. Airspace restrictions followed. Emergency powers were invoked under the justification of containment of unknown threats. Billy Butcher saw it coming and hated that he'd been right. "See, told you, can't have someone like that running around without a leash." Huey frowned. "He's not hurting anyone." "Doesn't matter," Butcher replied. "Power that can't be owned scares the wrong people." Vought escalated carefully. No subs at first, just pressure. Lawsuits filed against unknown entities. International warrants drafted for a man with no known identity, no social security number, no legal existence. Bureaucracy moved in where violence had failed. Then came the contractors. A specialized unit, quiet, well-funded, and officially non-existent, was dispatched to observe and, if possible, test Saitama. Not attack, not provoke, just data collection. The system needed to know if limits existed. They found him in a refugee shelter, helping rebuild a wall with borrowed tools. Children watched him work, laughing as he lifted beams that should have taken machines. When the units surrounded the building, Saitama noticed immediately. He set the beam down gently. "Can I help you?" he asked. The team leader froze. Every briefing had warned them about this moment. No hostility, no threat, just calm awareness. "Sir," the man said carefully, "we need you to come with us." Saitama tilted his head. "Why?" "For everyone's safety." Saitama looked past them at the shelter, at the people who would be left unprotected the moment he left. "No," he said. The word was quiet. The unit moved anyway. Tranquilizers, sonic emitters, experimental restraints designed to immobilize high-tier subs. None of it worked, not because Saitama resisted, but because the tools failed to register him as something they could affect. He stepped through the formation, disarming each agent with precise, non-injurious movements, laying them down like exhausted workers. He stopped in front of the team leader last. "Don't come back," Saitama said. "You're wasting resources." The footage leaked within the hour. Not the fight, the failure. Markets reacted violently. Governments denied involvement. Vought scrambled to contain the narrative, but something had shifted again. The system had pushed, and the push had revealed how fragile it really was. Homelander watched it all from a secure location, rage simmering beneath a growing dread. They weren't calling him anymore. He wasn't part of the solution. He wasn't even the problem. He was surplus. In a desperate bid to reclaim relevance, Homelander made a decision without Vought's approval. He chose a city, a large one, somewhere visible, somewhere Saitama would have to respond. He struck hard and fast, tearing through infrastructure, throwing vehicles, screaming accusations into the sky. Cameras caught everything. The world held its breath. Saitama arrived less than a minute later. He didn't rush. He didn't fly. He walked through the chaos, eyes scanning for survivors, ignoring Homelander entirely until a collapsing bridge forced his hand. He caught it with one arm, holding thousands of tons steady while emergency crews evacuated. Homelander screamed, firing lasers point-blank. They did nothing. Saitama set the bridge down and turned. This time, he didn't speak. He stepped forward and tapped Homelander's chest with 2 fingers. Not a punch, a correction. The air imploded outward, flattening everything within a mile radius without killing a single civilian. Homelander was launched skyward, spinning uncontrollably, his screams cutting off as he disappeared into the clouds. Saitama looked around at the stunned crowd. "Go home," he said. "It's over." For the first time in decades, people listened to someone without fear, without branding, without a logo behind him. The system felt it crack. Backrooms filled with arguments. Contingencies were burned. Vought's board fractured between those who wanted escalation and those who understood there was nothing left to escalate with. Butcher watched the replay, jaw tight. "He's not fighting the system," he said. "He's starving it." MM nodded slowly, and systems don't die quietly. Saitama stood alone on the bridge long after the cameras left, looking out over a city that no longer knew who was in charge. He wasn't satisfied. He wasn't finished. He could feel it now, the system reorganizing, shedding visible weapons, preparing something subtler. "This will get worse," he said to himself. And somewhere far above, hidden behind policy and procedure, the system prepared its next move. Not against Saitama's strength, against what came after he decided to use it. The city didn't riot. That surprised everyone who had bet on collapse. After decades of being conditioned to panic, to loot, to turn on itself the moment authority wavered, the city did something far more dangerous to the system. It slowed down. Traffic thinned. Offices emptied. People stayed home not out of fear, but because they no longer believed the structures telling them where to go mattered. That kind of stillness terrified Vought. Their internal projections had always assumed chaos as the failure state. Chaos could be blamed. Chaos could be crushed. What they were seeing instead was disengagement. Citizens were opting out of the narrative entirely, and there was no countermeasure for apathy paired with clarity. Saitama felt it as he moved through the streets. People didn't point. They didn't run. They watched him pass with wary curiosity, not all. Some nodded. Some didn't react at all. The absence of fear wasn't replaced by worship. It was replaced by expectation, quiet, unsettling expectation that if something went wrong, he would handle it. Not because he promised to, because he already had. That reliance bothered him more than hostility ever could. In a municipal building downtown, emergency officials argued in circles. Jurisdiction had become meaningless. Orders were issued and ignored, not in rebellion but in irrelevance. When someone finally asked who was actually in charge now, the room went silent. No one answered. Vought chose the city as the pressure point. Not with subs. With infrastructure. Utilities began failing in patterns too precise to be accidents. Power outages hit neighborhoods that had already suffered the most damage. Water pressure dropped. Emergency services were rerouted temporarily until response times tripled. No announcement accompanied it. No villain claimed responsibility. It was deniable, plausible, effective. Billy Butcher spotted it within hours. "They're squeezing civilians," he said, slamming a map down on the table. "Same trick every time. Make people beg for the old monsters back." Huey shook his head, "But it won't work if he doesn't intervene," Butcher cut in. "Yeah, that's the gamble." Saitama intervened anyway. Not by hunting executives, not by smashing control centers. He went where the pressure was applied hardest. He carried generators by hand to hospitals. He redirected floodwaters with careful movements that didn't destroy the streets they flowed through. He restored function without spectacle, refusing to create the chaos Vought needed. Every act made the city more dependent on him. That was the real trap. Vaught's analysts saw it clearly. "He's becoming a single point of failure," one said during a classified briefing. "If he ever leaves, the collapse will be worse than before." "So make him leave," another replied. Homelander was no longer useful for that. He was isolated, unstable, and increasingly irrelevant. The city didn't fear him enough anymore for his presence to matter. Vought needed a different lever. They chose the narrative again, but sharper this time. A new message rolled out across media channels. Saitama wasn't a hero. He was a bottleneck, a dangerous one. What happened if he made a mistake? What happened if he decided not to show up? The implication was subtle but poisonous. Dependence was reframed as danger. Saitama heard the broadcasts from passing screens and didn't react. Words didn't move him. Consequences did. And the consequence was clear. Every quiet fix he made allowed the system to avoid real responsibility. That realization slowed him. For the first time since arriving, he stopped intervening immediately. In one district, a standoff between police and armed contractors dragged on longer than it should have. People waited, watching the sky, expecting him to appear. He didn't. Not yet. When he finally arrived, someone had already been hurt. The look on his face changed. Not anger, wait. He ended the standoff in seconds, disarming everyone without injury, but the damage was done. The city had learned to pause instead of act. That night, Saitama stood on a rooftop overlooking miles of darkened blocks. He could feel the imbalance now, not of power, but of responsibility. The city was breaking not from violence, but from uncertainty about who was supposed to fix things. Vought capitalized immediately. A formal statement was released suggesting a provisional authority, an emergency stabilization council independent of corporate oversight. The same people, new name. They promised order, structure, predictability, everything Saitama refused to provide. Public opinion fractured. Some wanted him gone, some wanted him in charge. Neither option was acceptable. The boys watched the debate unfold with growing dread. "This is the point," MM said quietly, "where it goes bad no matter what he does." Butcher exhaled smoke, eyes narrowed. "Yeah, city's breaking, not from him, from what he represents." Homelander saw it too and snapped. He returned without warning, attacking one of the Provisional Council's public addresses, tearing through guards and screaming accusations about betrayal and weakness. The spectacle was meant to reclaim the narrative. It failed. The crowd scattered not in fear, but annoyance. Saitama arrived moments later. This time, he didn't soften the impact. He struck once, clean, precise, final. Homelander vanished from the sky in a sonic rupture that cracked windows across the city. He didn't die. He didn't even hit the ground. He was removed. The message was unmistakable. The city went silent. No cheers, no screams, just the sound of something ending. Saitama stood alone in the aftermath, realizing too late that removing the symbol didn't repair the structure beneath it. The city was still fractured. Authority was still hollow. And now, every remaining institution understood something critical. If Saitama acted again, it wouldn't be to save a street or stop a soup. It would be to decide who was allowed to exist in the system at all. Behind closed doors, the final contingencies were unlocked. The city had broken first. The world was next. The first thing the world did was pretend nothing had changed. Markets opened on schedule. Governments issued statements filled with cautious language and deliberate vagueness. Allies reassured allies. Enemies watched quietly. Every system that depended on routine leaned harder into it, as if repetition alone could reassert control. Behind the scenes, panic spread with surgical efficiency. Intelligence agencies compared notes they didn't want to share. Satellite footage was reviewed frame by frame, not to measure force, but to confirm the impossible pattern everyone had already noticed. No energy signatures, no detectable strain, no escalation curve, just outcomes. Saitama wasn't a weapon. Weapons left signatures. He was something else. Vought learned that lesson too late. The Provisional Council they had floated publicly was already unraveling. Cities outside the original impact zone refused to recognize its authority. Some cited legality. Others cited mistrust. A few admitted the real reason in private. If the system failed again, they didn't want to be associated with it when he showed up. Saitama didn't move. That worried them more than anything he had done. He stayed in the city walking streets that no longer asked him for help. People watched from windows now, measuring distance, timing, patterns. Not fear, calculation. The same way institutions studied storms, hopping prediction would substitute for control. The boys felt the shift immediately. This isn't about him anymore, Huey said, staring at a wall of international news feeds. It's about everyone else panicking without a way to panic at him. Butcher nodded. Worlds used to fight in power with bigger power. This thing, he gestured vaguely. There's nothing to punch. That didn't stop them from trying. The first international response wasn't military, it was bureaucratic. A coalition task force was announced under the guise of cross-border anomaly assessment. Scientists, diplomats, ethicists. Panels stacked on panels. The goal wasn't to confront Saitama, it was to define him. Definition was control by another name. Requests were made to meet him, carefully worded, respectful, urgent. They were ignored not deliberately but because Saitama didn't see the point. Talking didn't change outcomes, it just delayed them. That delay had consequences. In a coastal city thousands of miles away, a suit backed by a private defense contractor tested the waters. Not openly, not loudly. A security demonstration turned violent when protesters refused to disperse. The footage spread fast. People waited. Saitama didn't arrive. By the time he did, 3 blocks were on fire and the soup was already dead, killed by panicked civilians, not heroics. Saitama extinguished the flames with controlled shockwaves, rebuilt collapsed walls with careful hands, and stood amid the wreckage as survivors stared at him with something close to accusation. He had come too late. That spread faster than any propaganda. Vought seized on it instantly. See, one executive said during an emergency call, "He's not omnipresent, he can't be. We need redundancy." Redundancy meant escalation. Not upward but outward. Across the globe, private military firms, national defense programs, and corporate security divisions quietly expanded authority, not to challenge Saitama, but to fill the vacuum he refused to occupy fully. Power didn't consolidate, it fractured. Small tyrannies multiplied. Saitama felt it like static. He couldn't be everywhere. He didn't want to be. Every time he intervened, he trained the world to wait. Every time he didn't, someone suffered. For the first time, he hesitated. Not because he was unsure of himself, but because he understood the cost of certainty. Butcher watched the pattern form and cursed. "They're building a mess he can't punch away," he muttered. "That's the play, make the problem systemic." MM looked up, and if he decides to punch that? Butcher didn't answer. The answer arrived on its own. A summit was called. Publicly, it was about coordination. Privately, it was about contingency. Leaders gathered in a fortified complex, surrounded by layers of security designed to signal relevance more than provide protection. Saitama appeared without warning in the outer courtyard. No explosion, no impact, just presence. Security froze. Weapons stayed lowered, not out of obedience, out of understanding. Violence wouldn't register. Inside, panic spiked. Protocols fired in every direction. He didn't enter the building. He didn't need to. The leaders came to him, some trembling, some composed enough to fake calm. They spoke in turns, about order, about responsibility, about checks and balances. Saitama listened. Then he spoke. "I'm not replacing you," he said, voice even, unraised. "I'm not fixing what you break on purpose." The silence that followed was heavier than any threat. One leader, emboldened by desperation, asked the wrong question. "Then what happens when you leave?" Saitama looked at him for a long moment. "Then you live with what you chose." That was it. He turned and walked away. No ultimatum, no deadline. The message was clear. The world had misread him from the start. He wasn't a solution. He was a boundary, and boundaries only mattered if you respected them. Vought understood the implication immediately. If Saitama wasn't going to take responsibility, they would force a moment where he had to. A crisis too visible to ignore, too structured to fix quietly. Plans moved quickly, faster than before, sloppier too. Fear accelerated mistakes. Butcher intercepted fragments of it and felt his stomach drop. "They're going global," he said, "not with one thing, with lots of little ones." Huey swallowed. "They're daring him to choose." Saitama felt it coming, not as danger, as inevitability. He stood on a rooftop at dusk, watching the lights flicker on across a city that no longer believed in heroes, only outcomes. He had ended gods. He had erased symbols. But now the problem wasn't strength. It was permission. And the world was about to force his hand in a way no punch could undo. Somewhere deep in classified vaults, authorizations were signed that had never been meant to be used. The escalation had begun, not upward but everywhere at once. And this time, stopping it would mean choosing who the world was allowed to become. The escalation didn't arrive with explosions. It arrived with signatures. Authorizations buried under layers of legality activated at once, not to deploy weapons, but to redefine authority. Emergency powers passed quietly. Jurisdictions expanded. Oversight committees dissolved into executive silence. Across continents, the same logic repeated itself under different flags. If power could not be stopped, it would be managed. And if it could not be managed, it would be framed. Vought moved first, because Vought always did. They didn't announce a new hero or unveil a weapon. That would have been childish now. Instead, they launched a narrative initiative so dense it smothered nuance overnight. Analysts filled screens explaining selective intervention risk. Talking heads debated whether unchecked absolute force, even benevolent, was inherently destabilizing. Academics were paraded out to say what corporations wanted said. Saitama wasn't dangerous because he was violent. He was dangerous because he was unaccountable. That word spread fast. In cities that had never seen him, people began to talk less about what he had done and more about what he might do. The fear wasn't of destruction, it was of arbitrariness, of being judged without appeal. That fear gave institutions permission. The first containment zones appeared in the name of public safety. No walls, no troops, just algorithms, movement restrictions, predictive enforcement models calibrated around potential Saitama proximity. Neighborhoods that had benefited from his presence suddenly found themselves over-policed, scrutinized, isolated. The logic was simple. If chaos followed him, then managing chaos meant managing people. Saitama noticed the change not because he was told, but because streets felt tighter, quieter. People looked at him and then away, not in awe or fear, but calculation. He hadn't moved differently. The world had. The boys watched the roulette with growing alarm. "They're not responding to him," MM said. "They're responding to the idea of him." Frenchie nodded grimly. "It's easier to punish population than confront God." Butcher leaned forward, jaw tight. "They're building a cage without bars, and they're hopping he won't notice." He noticed. Not emotionally, practically. A convoy was stopped 3 blocks from where he stood one afternoon, drones hovering low, officers citing emergency jurisdiction. No one raised a weapon. They didn't have to. The restriction wasn't for him. It was for everyone else. Saitama stepped forward. The convoy froze, not out of fear but protocol failure. No rule existed for denying him access. None had been written. He looked at the officer in charge. "Why can't they go home?" The officer swallowed. "Preventive containment, sir." "For what?" The man hesitated. That pause was the answer. Saitama moved one step closer. The drones backed off automatically, sensors failing to categorize him as a variable. He didn't touch anything, didn't raise his voice. "Let them go," he said. The convoy complied. By morning, the footage was everywhere. Not of force, of defiance. Governments reacted badly. If Saitama could override authority without effort, then authority had to escalate somewhere he wouldn't or couldn't intervene, not physically. Symbolically, new protocols rolled out within hours, emergency powers codified into law, independent courts bypassed, corporate partnerships expanded. Vought positioned itself not as a ruler but as a stabilizer, offering infrastructure, analytics, control frameworks. They weren't opposing Saitama. They were replacing the need for him. Homelander watched it unravel from behind bulletproof glass, his relevance evaporating by the hour. He wasn't the strongest anymore. Worse, he wasn't useful. The world had moved past symbols that needed faces. For once, he understood how it felt to be ignored. Saitama didn't confront Vought directly. That would have been too clean. Instead, he walked, city to city, quietly dismantling moments of abuse, ending standoffs without spectacle, removing violent actors with precision so absolute it never made headlines. But the system adapted. Every intervention became a data point, a justification. "See," officials said, "unilateral interference destabilizes governance." Each life he saved was reframed as proof that he had chosen who mattered. The world learned how to weaponize restraint. The breaking point came not from a battlefield, but a broadcast. Vought aired a live emergency forum, leaders assembled, voices solemn. They didn't accuse Saitama. They mourned him, spoke about the danger of relying on singular power, about how humanity must grow beyond miracles. And then they unveiled the program. Not a weapon, a framework. Distributed enforcement authority empowered by compound V derivatives, limited, regulated, compliant. Not heroes, not gods, assets, hundreds of them, thousands eventually, weak individually, overwhelming collectively. Control made flesh. The crowd applauded. Saitama watched the broadcast from a rooftop, expression unchanged. He didn't interrupt, he didn't move. But the air shifted. The boys felt it immediately. "He's not mad," Huey said quietly. "He's deciding." Butcher swallowed. "That's worse." Because this wasn't about stopping villains anymore. It was about deciding whether a world that chose chains over chaos deserved intervention at all. That night, the first deployment happened. Not in a city Saitama had protected, but in one he had deliberately avoided. A demonstration turned violent when the new assets moved in. Not brutal, efficient, crowd control without empathy, fear without resistance, order enforced so cleanly it erased dissent entirely. Saitama arrived late again. And this time, he didn't act immediately. He stood at the edge of the square, watching people kneel not because they were guilty, but because compliance was easier than consequence. He understood now. This wasn't a crisis he could end with a punch. This was a world testing whether obedience felt safer than freedom. Saitama took a breath. And for the first time since arriving in this universe, he stepped into a situation knowing that whatever he did next would define not his power, but his responsibility. Above the city, networks rerouted. Emergency powers queued for expansion. Vought's framework waited for a response it was designed to survive. And somewhere deep in the system, a contingency was triggered, not to stop Saitama but to endure him. The moment was no longer about strength. It was about whether the world had chosen a future he would allow to exist. The square emptied without screams. People dispersed in clean lines, guided by calm voices and silent drones. No panic, no chaos, just obedience moving efficiently through designated exits. The new assets didn't pursue anyone who complied. They didn't need to. Compliance was the product. Saitama stood where the crowd had been moments earlier, the wind carrying scraps of paper and a single dropped shoe across the pavement. He looked around slowly, not searching for enemies, but for intent. Nothing here had been done out of rage or malice. That made it worse. The assets noticed him seconds later. Their response was immediate and rehearsed. They did not threaten. They did not posture. A voice issued from a speaker, calm and neutral, informing him that the area was under emergency jurisdiction and requesting voluntary disengagement. Saitama tilted his head slightly. Why? There was a pause, not confusion processing, for public stability. He stepped forward. Nothing stopped him. No alarms, no weapons raised. The assets adjusted formation instead, spacing themselves to contain the idea of disruption rather than the man himself. Their programming did not account for him as a hostile variable. He wasn't attacking anyone. He was simply there. The people watching from nearby buildings felt it immediately. Not fear, but pressure. The sense that something fundamental was being tested without violence. Phones came out. Streams went live. Not because this was exciting, but because no one knew what came next. Saitama looked at the nearest asset, young, nervous beneath the regulation calm, enhanced but not empowered. Who told you to do this? The asset hesitated. That hesitation rippled through the formation. Authority, it answered finally. Saitama nodded once. That's not an answer. He moved again. This time, the system reacted. Containment protocols activated, not weapons but barriers. Energy fields flared to life around the square, tuned to restrict movement rather than inflict harm. The technology was impressive, adaptive, designed by people who understood escalation and had learned the wrong lesson from it. Saitama touched the barrier. It didn't break. It simply ceased to exist. Not shattered, Not overloaded, just gone, as if it had never been there to begin with. Every sensor flatlined. The assets froze, not physically, but procedurally. Their authority depended on structures that had just been erased without effort. No command tree accounted for this. No escalation path led anywhere useful. Saitama walked through them. He didn't strike. He didn't disable. He passed between them like they were furniture, heading toward the central command van parked at the edge of the square. Inside, operators stared at screens that no longer updated. One whispered, "He's not resisting." Another replied, "He doesn't need to." Saitama stopped at the van door and knocked once. Someone opened it. The man inside was sweating, hands shaking over controls that suddenly felt meaningless. "Sir," he began, voice cracking, "this operation is authorized under." Saitama raised a hand. The man stopped talking. "You're not keeping people safe," Saitama said calmly. "You're keeping them quiet." The words carried farther than they should have, across the square, into cameras, into feeds that could not be suppressed fast enough. "But there's no alternative," the man protested. "Without control, it all falls apart." Saitama looked past him at the city beyond. Towers lit up like they always had, traffic moving, lives continuing. "It already did," he said. "You just decided who it falls on." He turned and walked away. Behind him, the command van lost power, not violently, just enough. Systems shut down gracefully like something being put to sleep. The asset stood there, unsure what to do next. And that uncertainty spread. Within hours, similar scenes played out across the world, not because Saitama traveled faster, but because people stopped waiting for permission. Local enforcement hesitated. Command chains stalled. Every time someone asked, "What if he shows up?" no one had an answer that didn't involve restraint. Vought panicked. This wasn't rebellion, it was erosion. Their framework relied on compliance enforced by inevitability. Saitama didn't oppose it directly, he exposed it. Every quiet intervention made the system look smaller. Every choice he refused to make forced others to confront theirs. Homelander watched the feeds with hollow eyes. For the first time, people weren't looking for someone to save them. They were looking for permission to act. He had never understood that kind of power. The boys regrouped in a half-lit room, tension thick. "He's dismantling it without touching the top," MM said. "That's terrifying." Butcher nodded slowly. "Aye, because now the bastards at the top have to decide whether to push harder." Huey swallowed. "And if they do?" Butcher looked at the screen showing Saitama walking alone through a city street, unbothered by cameras or crowds. "Then they're not challenging him, they're challenging the world." That challenge came the next morning. Vought made its move, not with assets but with law. Emergency charters were upgraded to permanent authority. National governments signed on, trading autonomy for stability. A unified command structure was announced, centralized and insulated. No faces, no accountability, just order. And buried in the legal language was a single clause. Any interference with stabilization efforts was now classified as an existential threat. Saitama read the clause on a public terminal. He stood there for a long time, not because he was unsure, but because he understood what it meant. The world had decided that peace enforced without consent was preferable to freedom with risk. They weren't afraid anymore. They were convinced. That kind of order didn't scream, it settled in. Saitama looked up at the sky, clear and quiet. He could end this, easily, permanently. The structures, the systems, the people behind them, it would take seconds. But what would be left afterward? He turned away from the terminal. Somewhere deep in Vought's highest security division, a final measure was unlocked. Not a weapon, a narrative, a declaration that would force Saitama into a position he had avoided since the beginning. They were going to make him choose. And this time, refusing might cost more than acting ever had. The announcement went live at noon. Not dramatic, not threatening, just clean, professional language delivered by neutral voices across every major network. A unified stabilization doctrine was now in effect. Enhanced enforcement would continue indefinitely. Civil liberties were acknowledged, respected, and deferred. All resistance, violent or otherwise, would be classified as destabilization. And then came the final line. Any anomaly exerting unilateral influence over public order, without authorization, would be treated as a systemic risk. They never said Saitama's name. They didn't need to. The world understood immediately. Saitama heard the announcement from a small shop television while standing in line behind a woman buying groceries. No one looked at him. No one whispered. No one panicked. People listened, nodded, and went back to their lists. That reaction unsettled him more than fear ever had. Obedience had become normal. Outside, enhanced patrols moved with new confidence. Not aggressive, certain. Their posture had changed. They weren't waiting to see what happened anymore. They believed the future had already been decided. Saitama walked the city for hours. Everywhere he went, the same pattern repeated. Quiet compliance, smooth enforcement, no chaos, no visible cruelty, just lives being narrowed one policy at a time. He stopped when he reached a schoolyard. Children sat in neat rows, supervised by 2 enhanced officers and a drone overhead. The kids laughed, played, obeyed instructions. Safe, controlled, watched. One of the officers noticed Saitama and stiffened. Protocols flared behind his eyes. This wasn't a hostile engagement. It was an assessment. "Sir," the officer said carefully, "this area is under educational stabilization. We ask that you maintain distance." Saitama looked at the children. "Why are you here?" The officer hesitated. "To ensure safety." "From what?" The officer didn't answer. Because the answer was everything. Saitama nodded once and stepped back. He didn't want to frighten the children. The officer relaxed just a little, reassured by compliance. That was the moment Saitama understood. This system wasn't built to fight him. It was built to outlast him. The boys were already underground, information networks collapsing around them as the new doctrine spread. Contacts went silent. Safe houses were compromised without raids. Pressure replaced violence. "They're squeezing everything," Frenchie said. "No heroes, no villains, just order." Butcher slammed his fist into the table. "That's the trick. If nobody's suffering loudly, nobody cares." Huey looked up. "What about him?" Butcher didn't answer right away. "He's not their enemy," he said finally. "He's their excuse." That night the world watched as a small protest formed in a city Saitama had never visited. Not violent, not organized, just people standing still, holding signs asking simple questions. The response was immediate. Assets moved in, barriers deployed, drones descended, orders were given calmly. Saitama arrived as the first arrests began. Not fast, not dramatic. He walked into the square as if he had all the time in the world. People saw him and froze. Not in fear, in expectation. The assets recognized him instantly. New protocols activated. This time there were weapons not to hurt him but to project authority. Fields flared. Sonic deterrence pulsed. Saitama felt them brush against him like static. "Disperse," a voice commanded. "This assembly is unauthorized." Saitama didn't look at the assets. He looked at the people being dragged away. "Let them go," he said. The command hesitated, then refused. That was new. The assets advanced, not toward Saitama but past him, continuing arrests with increased efficiency. They weren't challenging him. They were ignoring him. That cut deeper than any attack. Saitama stepped forward. A containment field wrapped around him instantly, denser than anything before. It didn't push. It didn't burn. It anchored. Designed not to stop force. Designed to delay. The crowd gasped. Cameras zoomed in. For the first time, people saw Saitama contained. Not defeated. Contained. Saitama looked at the field, then at the people watching. He could break this. Easily. But if he did it now, violently, publicly, he would confirm every justification they had built. So he waited. The arrests continued. Someone screamed. Saitama's hand clenched. He exhaled. The field vanished, not by breaking, but by failing. Systems overloaded not from power, but contradiction. You could not anchor something that refused to push back. Saitama stepped through. The assets stopped moving. Every single one. Their systems froze, not disabled, but locked in conflict resolution loops they couldn't escape. They hadn't been designed to handle refusal without resistance. Saitama didn't touch them. He walked to the detainees and cut their restraints with careful precision. No force, no spectacle. "Go home," he said. They ran. The feeds exploded. Vought reacted instantly, reframing the event as a near catastrophe narrowly avoided by protocol safeguards. They emphasized the restraint of their assets, the danger of unilateral interference, the risk of chaos. But the damage was done. People had seen it. Not Saitama's strength, his restraint, and more importantly, the system's willingness to proceed without consent. Protests spread, not against Vought, against obedience itself. That scared the world far more than Saitama ever had. Governments escalated again, this time openly, martial doctrines renamed, surveillance expanded, assets redeployed with authorization to preempt dissent entirely. The message was clear. Order would be maintained, even if people didn't want it. Saitama stood alone on a rooftop as night fell, watching the lights flicker across a city that no longer knew whether it was safe or simply quiet. He understood now. This wasn't about stopping villains. It was about deciding whether a world that chose obedience over freedom should be allowed to keep that choice. And for the first time since arriving, Saitama faced a problem that couldn't be solved by ending something broken. Because what stood in front of him wasn't a monster. It was a system people had agreed to live under. Below him, sirens sounded, not in panic but coordination. And somewhere deep within Vaught's structure, a final escalation moved into position. One that would force Saitama to either become exactly what they feared, or walk away and let the world cage itself. The city woke up quieter than it had ever been. Not the calm of peace, the quiet of compliance. Sirens still sounded, but on schedules now. Drones moved in predictable grids. People left their homes when told, returned when permitted, and avoided eye contact with anything that might ask them to choose. Saitama stood on the edge of a rooftop and watched it all unfold without intervening. That was the mistake. Not his, the world. Because the moment people realized he was not acting, something inside them shifted. At first, it wasn't anger. It was rationalization. Maybe this was necessary. Maybe this was safer. Maybe this was just how things worked now. Silence became permission. Vought wasted no time filling it. They didn't send assets after Saitama. They didn't need to. Instead, they turned their attention outward, accelerating enforcement everywhere he was. Entire districts were placed under predictive stabilization. People were detained not for what they had done, but for what models suggested they might do. And when families protested, they were shown footage. Not of violence, of Saitama, standing still. He chose not to intervene, spokespeople said calmly. That proves the necessity of order. That lie spread faster than any truth ever could. The boys saw it coming and couldn't stop it. "This is sick," Huey said, watching footage of peaceful neighborhoods locked down without incident. "They're using him as cover." Butcher slammed the screen off. "They always were. Difference is now it's working." Leaned forward. "If he steps in now, they call it tyranny. If he doesn't, they call it endorsement." Frenchie shook his head slowly. "God who does nothing still shapes world." Saitama felt the weight of that truth settle over him like gravity. He walked through a district under full stabilization late that afternoon. No protests, no resistance, just lines of people waiting for verification scans. A child cried softly as an officer adjusted a wrist tag too tight. The officer apologized without changing anything. Saitama stopped. The officer looked up, recognition flickering behind training. "Sir," he said cautiously, "please continue moving." Saitama didn't. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. The officer hesitated, not because he didn't know, but because the answer no longer mattered. "Orders," he said. "It keeps things from getting worse." Saitama looked around. Worse than what? The officer didn't respond. Because worse had become abstract. The future was now a justification for anything. Saitama reached out and loosened the child's wrist tag, just enough, not breaking it, not disabling it. The officer stiffened. "Sir, interference." Saitama met his eyes. "You don't need permission to do the right thing." The officer froze. Then slowly, he loosened the tag himself. Nothing exploded, no alarm sounded, the system didn't collapse. One small act of disobedience passed unnoticed. And that scared the system more than rebellion ever had. By nightfall, the response came down hard. Stabilization protocols upgraded again, non-compliance reclassified as systemic threat. Officers were rotated out if hesitation was detected. New assets arrived, less human, more efficient. The world was correcting for doubt. Saitama watched it escalate and felt something unfamiliar tighten in his chest. Not frustration, responsibility. He could end this. He knew that, tear the framework apart, erase Vought, collapse the enforcement structure in minutes. No one could stop him. But what would replace it? If he acted now, he wouldn't just be removing oppression. He'd be deciding the future by force. And if he didn't, he was allowing people to be crushed by a system that had learned how to hide its violence behind order. Silence had become complicity. The breaking point came without warning. A city went dark. Not a blackout, erasure. Communications cut, feeds severed. Stabilization drones flooded the streets under a classified emergency designation. By the time outside networks noticed, it was already done. No footage leaked. No bodies shown. Just silence. Vought issued a statement citing containment of a destabilizing anomaly. No details, no names. Saitama felt it immediately. He didn't run. He didn't fly. He stepped and arrived. The city was intact, buildings standing, streets clean, too clean. People moved in straight lines, eyes unfocused, responses delayed. Compliance so deep it had crossed into absence. Saitama realized the truth too late. They hadn't crushed resistance. They had removed it. Not physically, psychologically. Neural conditioning, emotional dampening, compliance reinforced at the biological level, a city rendered peaceful by subtraction. This was the future Vought had chosen. And they had done it while he stood still. Saitama walked through the streets as people passed him like furniture. He spoke to them. They responded politely, empty, alive but no longer choosing. This wasn't order. It was silence perfected. High above, satellites adjusted. Authorization cascades triggered. The system detected him and adapted, not with force but finality. A global address interrupted every screen. A calm voice announced that, due to escalating anomalies and unilateral interference risks, stabilization would proceed to its final phase. Permanent compliance. Saitama looked up. He understood now. This was the moment they had been building toward, not a confrontation with him, but a future where he no longer mattered. If he acted, he became the tyrant they warned about. If he didn't, the world would never choose again. Saitama closed his eyes. For the first time in this universe, he made a decision not about stopping something broken, but about whether a world that surrendered its will deserved to be left alone. And as that thought settled, the air around him shifted. Not with violence, with inevitability. The final phase had begun. The transition happened quietly. No countdown, no alarms, no dramatic announcement beyond the calm broadcast already looping across every surviving network. Stabilization phase final was framed as an administrative inevitability, the logical conclusion of a process already in motion. The language was precise, sanitized, and deliberately bloodless. Choice was not mentioned. Saitama stood in the center of the silent city as the systems finished calibrating. He could feel it now, not as pressure or resistance, but as absence. The subtle hum of decision-making, the unpredictable rhythm of human will, had been dampened to a uniform frequency. People still walked, still spoke, still lived, but nothing inside them pushed back anymore. This wasn't control through fear. It was control through removal. He watched a man trip on the sidewalk and fall hard. People stepped around him, careful not to interfere with flow efficiency. The man stood back up on his own, nodded to no one, and continued walking without complaint. No anger, no embarrassment, no frustration. Saitama clenched his fists. Not because he was angry, because he understood the scale of what had been done. Vought hadn't built a cage around humanity. They had hollowed it out. In a secure facility far from the city, executives and officials monitored biometric feeds with tight, controlled satisfaction. Resistance metrics were flatlining. Psychological variance was within acceptable thresholds. Crime had dropped to near zero. Protests no longer formed. Compliance was total. "This is stability," one official said quietly. "This is what we were always trying to achieve." Another hesitated, and him. A pause, then carefully, "He's irrelevant now." That was the moment they lost. Saitama walked until he reached the city's central hub, a tower humming with signal relays and processing cores. The building wasn't guarded in the traditional sense. It didn't need to be. Nothing attacked it because nothing wanted to. He stepped inside. The systems registered him instantly, not as a threat but as a deviation. Corrective routines spun up around him, attempting to normalize presence. Lighting adjusted, ambient noise recalibrated, temperature smoothed. The building tried to make him comfortable. Saitama ignored it. He moved deeper, past technicians who glanced at him and then returned to their consoles without curiosity. No fear, no interest, just acceptance. That acceptance hurt more than hostility ever could. He reached the core chamber, a vast, quiet space where the final directives converged. Streams of data flowed like veins through transparent conduits, carrying instructions that told millions of people how to live without asking them what they wanted. Saitama stood there for a long time. He didn't destroy anything. He listened. He felt the structure of the system, not as code or machinery, but as intent. It wasn't malicious. It wasn't cruel. It was efficient. Designed by people who genuinely believed that safety was worth any cost, as long as they weren't the ones paying it. Saitama raised his hand. Not to punch, to decide. If he destroyed this system, violently and completely, he would return chaos to the world overnight. People would wake up confused, afraid, and free all at once. Governments would collapse, power vacuums would form, millions would suffer in the transition. If he left it intact, humanity would continue on this path, peaceful, orderly, and empty, alive but never choosing again. The species would persist, the people would not. This was the consequence of power taken seriously. Not the fight. The aftermath. The boys watched the feeds die one by one from their hidden position. Frenchie paced. Sat rigid, jaw clenched. Huey stared at a blank screen, heart pounding. "He's in the core," Huey whispered. "This is it." Butcher said nothing. He knew better than to hope for a clean ending. Inside the tower, the system made its final attempt to assert authority. A voice filled the chamber, calm and inhuman, informing Saitama that his presence was unnecessary, that the world had chosen stability, that deviation would be corrected. Saitama looked up. "You didn't ask them," he said. The system responded instantly. "Consent is inefficient." That answer settled everything. Saitama stepped forward and placed his hand against the central conduit. He didn't destroy it. He didn't overload it. He touched it. The effect rippled outward, not as an explosion but as a recalibration. Signals scrambled, not randomly but deliberately. Compliance protocols unraveled. Neural dampening fields dissolved. Emotional range returned like blood to numb limbs. Across the city, people stopped. Some cried. Some screamed. Some collapsed under the weight of feelings they hadn't known were missing. The system fought back, not against Saitama but against reality itself. Emergency failsafes triggered, attempting to restore order. Power surged. Towers trembled. Saitama remained still. Then, with a single, precise motion, he applied force, not outward but inward. One punch. Not at the city. Not at the world. At the concept of enforced compliance. The core imploded silently, collapsing in on itself and taking the final phase protocols with it. No shockwave escaped the building. No collateral damage followed. But the system was gone. Everywhere at once. Outside, the city erupted not in violence but confusion. People shouted, argued, ran, laughed, cried, chose. Freedom returned messy and uncontrolled. Exactly as it had always been. Saitama stepped out of the tower as sirens wailed, not in coordination but panic. Assets froze, their directives gone. Vought's global feeds cut out mid-sentence. Butcher exhaled slowly as the reality hit him. "Bloody hell," he muttered. He didn't just end it. He undid it, said quietly. Saitama looked at the city around him, now alive in a way it hadn't been in days. The cost would be high. Chaos would follow. People would make terrible choices again. But they would be their choices. High above, emergency councils scrambled to regain control. Vought's empire collapsed in real time. Authority fractured. Narratives shattered. And in the center of it, all stood one man who had just decided that a world without choice was not a world worth protecting. But he also knew something else. He could not stay. Because the moment people realized who had given them back their will, they would look to him for guidance, for rules, for order. And that was a responsibility he refused to take. As dawn approached, Saitama walked away from the city without announcement or farewell. Behind him, the world struggled back into motion, loud, imperfect, dangerous, and alive. Ahead of him, something else waited. Because power that removes choice can be punched away. But power that returns it always leaves consequences behind. And those consequences were already taking shape. The collapse didn't look like an ending. It looked like noise. Arguments erupted everywhere at once, streets filled with shouting, laughter, rage, confusion. Some people hugged strangers, others shoved them. Old grudges resurfaced in minutes. New ones formed even faster. Freedom returned not as a gift, but as a weight people had forgotten how to carry. Government scrambled. Emergency councils convened, dissolved, reconvened under new names. Half the officials who had signed off on permanent compliance denied responsibility within hours. The other half disappeared. Vought's leadership attempted to reassert control through statements that contradicted each other sentence by sentence. Nothing stuck, because there was no longer a system enforcing belief. The boys emerged into the chaos cautiously, like people stepping outside after a storm only to realize the landscape had changed shape. Huey watched crowds argue in the street and felt sick. "This is what he left behind," he said quietly. Butcher shook his head. "No, this is what they were suppressing." Crossed his arms. "Doesn't matter, people are gonna die now, not because they're controlled, but because they're free." Frenchie exhaled smoke into the air. "Freedom always messy. Question is who cleans up." That question echoed across the world. Because Saitama was gone. No farewell, no explanation, no promise to return. And that absence terrified people more than his presence ever had. Within days, new movements formed. Some treated him like a savior, others like a criminal. A few understood the truth, that he hadn't saved the world or doomed it. He had simply removed a lie and walked away. But humanity didn't know how to live without someone holding the ceiling up. Militaries mobilized again, not against him, but against each other. Borders hardened. Old conflicts reignited under the justification of reasserting stability. Subs tried to reclaim relevance, stepping into power vacuums with varying degrees of brutality. Homelander tried too. For the first time in his life, no one was watching the way he wanted them to. He appeared in public broadcasts, shouting about order, about strength, about how the world needed someone to lead. The response was laughter, anger, indifference. He wasn't feared anymore. He wasn't trusted. He was just another loud voice in a world full of them. He broke completely off camera. Vought's remnants attempted one final gambit, leaking classified footage, framing Saitama as the true destabilizing force. They showed the erased city, the chaos afterward. They asked the question people were already afraid to answer. Was this better? The world argued. Some demanded new systems. Others demanded nothing ever like that again. A few whispered that maybe compliance had been safer. And in that uncertainty, something dangerous grew. Not a villain. An idea. That if one man could take choice away, and another could give it back, then maybe the next one should decide better. That idea spread fast. But Saitama was already far from it all. He walked along an empty highway at dawn, hands in his pockets, expression unreadable. Cities burned behind him, not literally everywhere, but socially, politically, ideologically. The sound of it carried faintly on the wind. He didn't look back. He had done what he believed was right. That didn't mean it wouldn't hurt. Because now the world had to choose what to do with the freedom it had begged for, without understanding the cost. And many of those choices would be terrible. Somewhere far away, a group of leaders met in secret discussing the unthinkable, not recreating the old system, but improving it, making it smarter, subtler, voluntary at first. "Next time," one of them said quietly, "we don't let a single variable decide everything." The others nodded. The lesson hadn't been learned. It had been adapted. Saitama felt that shift as a faint pressure behind his eyes, not danger, not threat, but inevitability. Humanity always rebuilt cages. Sometimes they even called them homes. He stopped walking and stood there for a moment, the sun rising over a world that no longer knew whether it wanted to be saved or controlled. He understood then that what he had done wasn't the end of anything. It was the start of something worse. Because now, without a system to blame, Every consequence belonged to the people who chose it. And somewhere down the line, someone would try again to take that choice away. Only next time they would be smarter, quieter, more patient. Saitama resumed walking, not toward a battle, but away from a world that had finally been forced to grow up. Behind him, humanity argued, rebuilt, and prepared, consciously or not, for the day someone else decided power should choose for them. And that day would come, because it always did. The world didn't end. That was the cruelest part. It staggered forward, bruised but breathing, louder than before and far less certain of itself. Markets reopened unevenly. Governments reformed under new banners that looked suspiciously like the old ones. Sups rebranded, rearmed, and reinserted themselves into places where authority was weakest. Nothing collapsed all at once. Everything cracked slowly. Freedom did that. Without a system enforcing calm, humanity argued its way back into motion. Some cities burned. Others stabilized through community, not control. A few places surprised everyone and rebuilt something better, not perfect but chosen. Vought never recovered. Its assets were seized, its leadership scattered or imprisoned, its name poisoned beyond repair. The idea that a corporation could define safety died publicly and violently, but the impulse behind it survived, migrating quietly into governments, think tanks, private coalitions that swore they'd learned from past mistakes. They always said that. The boys faded from relevance as the world changed around them. Their war had been against monsters in suits. Now the monsters wore ideas, and those were harder to shoot. Butcher watched it all from a distance, older than he felt he should be. "He didn't save us," he said one night, voice flat. "He just stopped the worst of it." MM nodded. "Sometimes that's all anyone can do." Huey looked out at a city, rebuilding itself badly and honestly. "At least now it's us messing it up." That was the truth no one liked. Saitama walked alone, far from cameras, far from cities that whispered his name like a curse or a prayer. He didn't hide. He just didn't matter anymore, and that was intentional. Power that stayed became authority. Authority became expectation. Expectation became obligation. He wanted none of it. Along the road, he passed people arguing over directions, laughing too loud, fighting over nothing important. He saw kindness without instruction and cruelty without permission. Messy, human things. He let it exist. The world didn't need him to guide it. It needed him to leave it alone. And yet, consequences followed him anyway. Far behind, new doctrines formed, ethical stabilization, voluntary compliance frameworks, systems built not on force but persuasion, incentives, nudges, softer cages, smarter ones. People opted in because it felt safer. History repeating itself with better branding. Saitama sensed it distantly, like thunder over the horizon, not a threat, a reminder. He could come back someday. He could tear it all down again. But then what? Every time power fixed the problem, humanity learned the wrong lesson. They stopped choosing, they waited. So he kept walking. Not because he was tired, because staying would make things worse. Years later, stories would circulate of a quiet man who ended gods, of a presence that made systems collapse just by standing still, of a punch that destroyed not a building or an enemy, but an idea. Most would dismiss them. Some would believe. A few would prepare. But none of that changed the truth. When Saitama took the boys' universe seriously, he didn't become its savior. He became its limit. The line it crossed and could never uncross. The moment power stopped being something to worship and started being something to fear for the right reasons. The world learned that absolute strength didn't shout. It didn't rule. It didn't stay. It arrived, judged quietly, acted once, and walked away, leaving humanity with the only burden that ever mattered: Joyce. And this time, no one else was going to make it for them.